that recording now, and we're going to let Diane and Carol get started.
Hi everybody. This is Carol Burris from the Network for Public Education. I'm so happy that you were able to join us this evening, and hopefully all of you are well on the other end. And if you're not well, that you're recovering, and we provide a nice distraction for the evening. Certainly we are living through unusual times, and not the times that we anticipated at all. Our conference had to be rescheduled to November, and much of Diane's book tour had to be shut down. So we thought, well, you know what, if Diane can't go to the tour, then maybe the tour can come to Diane. And that's what we're hoping to do tonight. So welcome, Diane. Please tell everybody how you're faring, and give them the news that you're well.
Well, hi, this is Diane, and I'm very, very happy to have my photograph there and not my face, because I haven't been able to get a haircut for about a month. And I feel, hope you can understand this. I needed a haircut a month ago, so I feel like the Wicked Witch of the West right now, or maybe the Good Witch of, I forget which one. But I'm very happy to be on the phone with you, because it's good to know that we're all staying in the fight. Stuff will resume one of these days. I don't think we'll be back in school until September. I don't think it would be wise to reopen schools before September, and I hope we can have the kids back in school then. But I'm well. I'm in isolation with my partner and my 100-pound dog, and I walk her 3 times a day, which keeps me active and moving. I'm also working on a piece for Education Week, which is a summary of the book, and it's something we'll talk about tonight. But it's what I tried to do in the article was to say that on the one hand, you have some of the anti-public school people saying, oh, isn't this great? Everyone's going to want to homeschool. Everyone's going to want to have virtual schooling, having had the shutdown. And my view is it's quite the opposite, that parents have a newfound appreciation for how hard it is to be a teacher. And I keep seeing tweets and videos where parents say, I'm having an impossible time with my 2 children, and scheduling their school meetings and conferences and so forth. And frankly, I don't understand how one teacher can do this all day long. And my favorite tweet is the woman who said, after having homeschooled my children now for an hour and 11 minutes, I think the teachers should be paid $1 billion a year. Or maybe $1 billion a month or a week. But I think there will be, when kids get back to school, a tremendous resurgence of appreciation for the work of our public schools, and particularly for the work of their teachers. And it's going to create, I believe it'll create a new mood. So while there's very little to feel good about these days, I do think that the parent love and appreciation for teachers and for public schools is coming through very, very strongly.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, Diane, because, and see what your opinion might be. I mean, looking at the whole trajectory of Slaying Goliath and all of the books that you've written about education reform, a lot of the reform movement happened when the economy was bad, right? In 2008, and people were getting desperate, and they cut all the funding from public schools. And then gradually the economy got better, and we saw the Red for Ed movement, and people respond to the Red for Ed movement. You know, teachers were no longer the enemies, and everybody was worried about their pay and getting them to catch up. I mean, what do you think is going to happen now as we see revenues drop like a stone? Do you think we're going to be going back to the old wars?
Well, I think we're going to have very, very hard times, because everybody's budgets, state budgets, urban districts, all school districts are going to feel a tremendous strain. But I think that parents, at least this is just my guess, nobody frankly knows what's going to happen, certainly not I, but I believe that there will be much stronger support to protect public schools from the inevitable budget cuts. That doesn't mean that they won't be cut, but there will be cuts across the board on all kinds of public services. And there will also be a lot of pushback to protect the public schools to the greatest extent possible. One of the things that strikes me is, and it did in writing Slaying Goliath, was that the idea of choice became a substitute for actually investing in public education. And that a lot of the money that's gone into the choice movement has come from very wealthy people who simply don't want to pay more taxes. And there's going to be some very serious rethinking about where the revenues are coming from and whether we can maintain the dramatic inequality in terms of the very small number of incredibly wealthy people, the multi-billionaires, and on the other hand, people who are suffering tremendously from the lack of public services, the lack of decent jobs. I mean, the post-pandemic world is one that none of us can totally predict. I don't think things will go back to the way they were, but I think that in terms of our children, we have to think about them as they're the future of this country, and we can't balance budgets on the backs of the children, which is the fight that's going to be held in every state in this country as well as in Congress.
Yeah. So let's go back and talk a little bit about Slaying Goliath, and if you could just tell everybody who's listening, why did you write the book? I mean, my gosh, you've written so many books and you've contributed so generously to the field of education. Why was Slaying Goliath important to you?
Well, you know, 2 years ago, and that was in February of 2018, I thought at that time that I was finished with writing books about education. I thought, well, I'm now, let's say I'm 81 right now. I was 79 then. And I thought, I've done everything I can do. I'm now just going to write my memoirs. And I was about a third of the way through that project when the teachers in West Virginia walked out. And I was, like so many people, absolutely obsessed with what they had done, because, as you know, West Virginia is a state where it's illegal to strike. And yet they struck in every single school in every single district. And at the time it was dramatic, but then it turned into a rolling wave across the country in Oklahoma and in Arizona and Colorado and eventually in California, and then started coming back to Chicago and Los Angeles, and on it went. And it was in February of 2018 that I became taken with the idea that this represented a sea change, and that we have had 20 years or more, if you go back to the Reagan administration and the 1983 report called of the National Commission on Excellence, which talked about public schools representing a rising tide of mediocrity. It was called A Nation at Risk. So that was 1983. So we've had like 17 and 20, 37 years of public school bashing and claims that somehow the private sector was always going to be better than the public sector. And it seemed to me, when I look at the last 3 books I've written, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, which I wrote in 2010, was like my confessional, where I said, hey guys, I've been on the wrong side, and let me explain to you why I think I was wrong, and I got to make up for it by trying to tell you what I know. An effort to change the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so some people have said that was part 1 and that your second book was part 2 and that Slaying Goliath was part 3. Is that how you view the series?
Well, actually I do, because part 1 was my saying I was wrong, and here's why I was wrong, and testing and choice are not answers to the problems of American education or American society. And then the reason I wrote the second book, Reign of Error, was because I was traveling with a reporter for the New Yorker, and he said to me, well, I've talked to your critics and they say that you have all the long list of what's wrong with them, you know, why the critics are wrong, but where are your solutions? So I wrote Reign of Error specifically to say, this is what we should be doing instead. And about a third of the book is devoted to solutions of what we should be doing, starting with providing prenatal care for all pregnant women. And it turns out that among the nations in the world, the United States is one of the worst in providing prenatal care for pregnant women. And that has enormous consequences for their children who are born to mothers who didn't know how to take care of themselves. So that's the first of a long list of things we should be doing to make our schools and our society and our families and our communities whole and healthy. But what happened with Slaying Goliath was the teacher strikes made me think that we had turned a corner, and that the whole conversation, the national conversation, the national narrative had suddenly changed, and that we saw national publications like Time Magazine, Newsweek magazines, and the media, the TV media, turn sympathetic to public schools and the teachers, and began to tell the stories of how poorly teachers were paid, how many teachers were working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, selling their blood, taking money out of their pocket to pay for school supplies. And it was a whole new narrative. And that made me think of all the stories I had been collecting over the years of the heroes, the unsung heroes. And I decided that I wanted to tell their story. And that the teacher strikes were actually the culmination of what was really a ferment of resistance to the attacks on public schools and on public school teachers. And so that's really the 3 parts. And I have to say there will not be a 4th part. This is it.
Well, you never know, Diane. You never know. I mean,
that's what I said last time.
So, well, one of the you have so many wonderful stories in the book, and one of the ones that I love is this story of what happened in Washington with Jesse Hagopian and the teachers up there and the resistance to standardized testing. I'm wondering if you could share that with the listeners tonight.
Well, Jesse is a really stand-up guy. He's a teacher at Garfield High School. After my book appeared, he was briefly fired and then rehired. It may have been a punitive move, but he tells the story of the resistance there. The schools of Seattle were using a test for high school called the MAP test. And I'm right now trying to remember what it's an acronym for. Maybe you know, Carol, I've forgotten. But the MAP test is used virtually in all grades. And it's 3 times a year standardized test assessment where you're supposed to determine whether children are making progress from the first test to the second test to the third test. And the high school teachers thought, they began talking among themselves and saying, this is really a useless test. It doesn't test what we're teaching, and it's wasting our kids' time, and it's using up the computers in the library when the kids don't have access to computers at home. And they began talking among themselves and agreed that they would not administer the test. And they took a stand and they said, we're going to boycott the test. And the entire school faculty agreed to boycott it. The parent association and the students as well supported them. And the superintendent of schools was extremely unsympathetic and made various threats and said that if they didn't administer the test, that they would be docked 10 days pay. Some of them would be fired. And they were really making hard decisions about whether or not to stick to their guns when they began getting, first of all, a national reaction where teachers were sending them pizzas and flowers and candies and cookies. And then they began getting an international reaction, and the national media were coming to the school to interview them. And at one point they met with the superintendent, the teachers of Garfield High School, and Jesse Hagopian had been trying his best to persuade the superintendent to give in on the testing. And he said to him, CNN is coming, and I will tell CNN that you're a really great superintendent if you cancel the test. And this could be a real career changer for you. Well, the superintendent didn't buy that. But what happened eventually was that because the teachers stood together, stood strong, refused to give the test, at one point they even threatened to have the principals administer the test and the administrators administer it because the teachers refused to. And then the kids were sympathetic, obviously, to not having to take the test. So they were just going in and pressing the letter A and not giving answers. And eventually the superintendent gave in, and they won the fight. They won the fight. And that was the important thing. The, the sad fact was they continued to give the MAP test in K through 8, which was also totally inappropriate in those grades. But they did, the teachers at Garfield managed to get it taken out of the high schools altogether. So that was a victory for them. You could have mentioned almost any of the stories in the book, and I would wax enthusiastic about them because I got very, very engaged with every one of these stories of resistance. I love the story of G2 Brown in Chicago because, as many of you know, Rahm Emanuel, when he was mayor, closed 50 schools in one day. And I've always thought this was one of the worst things I've ever heard of. And there's a wonderful book that was written about the school closures by a brilliant young writer named Eve Ewing. She was a teacher in one of the schools, and she wrote a book called Ghosts in the Schoolyard. And if you're looking for something really engaging to read during this period in which we're all stuck in isolation, I recommend it to you. It's about what the closing of those 50 schools meant to the children and to the parents and to the grandparents and to the community. And Rahm Emanuel and his superintendents, and at that time I think it was Barbara Bird Bennett, who's in jail now, but they were extremely unsympathetic to emotional pleas. But there was one school, one remaining open enrollment school in the Black community it was called Bronzeville. The community is Bronzeville, or was known as Bronzeville. And it had one remaining open enrollment high school, the Walter Diet High School. And Emanuel had announced that they were going to close that. It was going to be an all choice system like New York is now. And G2 Brown and his allies protested, and they went to, every time Rahm Emanuel appeared, they would carry signs saying, "Don't close Diet, save Diet." And Rahm Emanuel ignored them. He ignored everything they did. And they finally came up with the idea of having a hunger strike. And they took their lawn chairs and they sat on the front lawn of the campus of the Walter Diet High School, which by then had been almost completely emptied out. And they sat there and they said they were going to stay on a hunger strike until Rahm Emanuel agreed to reopen the school. And that was in September, I think it was 2015. And they sat there for 34 days. And on the 34th day, they were getting a lot of national publicity. And the pressure on Mayor Emanuel was so great that he capitulated. And instead of closing the school, he invested $14, $15, $16 million. And it reopened as the Walter Diet High School for the Arts. And it's now a thriving school and reborn because of 12 people with their lawn chairs. Didn't cost a penny, but they beat the power. Lots of wonderful stories like that.
Yeah, they beat the power. And one of the things that's so terrific about the book, Diane, is that you have this juxtaposition of people who have little, but their voice and their commitment, and then those who have a lot. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the folks that you mentioned in the book that you think did, no matter what their motivation may have been, at times it may have been good, but they did the most damage to public schools through that era of reform.
Well, of course, it's not over yet. And I always have to point out that when I talk about slaying Goliath, it's an active verb. Goliath is not dead. I never read or never wrote anywhere that the fight is over and that reform is dead. It's not. I compare it to the Soviet Union, which was dead about 10 years before it actually dissolved, and to various other metaphors. There's a metaphor of a man who decapitated a rattlesnake in his backyard, and he waited for 10 minutes until he thought the snake was completely dead. And he picked up its head, and then the decapitated head bit him, and it was so venomous that he ended up almost dying. So even in this case, Goliath, while he is not dead, he is actually, my argument is, he's brain dead, because all of the ideas that have been put forward under the mantle of reform have not reformed anything. They have in fact been destructive, disruptive, and ineffective, and extremely harmful. And so it's impossible for me to think of one come forward from these people that has helped children or families or communities. Instead, they have been committed to disruption is their strategy and their end game. So when I say who are these people? Well, I go back to the first in this series of 3 books, and I had a chapter 10 called The Billionaire Boys Club, where I identified 3 foundations that had been the leaders of this movement, and they're still there. Number 1 would be the Walton Foundation, because they put up the most money, and they are anti-public school. They claim credit for having opened 1 out of every 4 charter schools in the country. They're anti-union, and they're anti-union in the Walmart stores. They don't pay their workers a living wage, and they don't really see why teachers should get a living wage either. They've been huge supporters of Teach for America. They've given them many, many millions of dollars. And because the family is worth $150 billion, or at least they were before the stock market went down. Maybe now they're worth only $140 billion, but it's a B, not an M. They have been incredibly hostile and led this movement to harm public schools. Then the second in the triumvirate of the Billionaire Boys Club was Bill Gates. And Bill Gates I think he's a well-meaning person. It's hard for me to know. I've never met him. I've tried repeatedly to meet him. And I've been to Seattle many times, and he has never been available to talk to me. But I did meet with the head of the Gates Foundation, who just took notes and didn't really talk to me. But Bill Gates is a man who has lots of ideas. And if he has an idea, no one ever says it's a bad idea, I guess. I don't know. Because he just foists his ideas on the schools and causes a lot of damage without listening to the voices of teachers or the real effects of what he's doing. And he began with the idea of all the schools needed to be broken up into small schools, which is not a harmful idea. It's not a bad idea. It just didn't accomplish what he thought it would. He thought it would raise test scores because that was all he was interested in. It didn't raise test scores, but lots of large high schools were broken up. But he abandoned that idea in 2008. His next big idea was evaluating teachers by the test scores of their students, and that was a disaster. And in my book, I write about something that you wrote, Carol, where you analyzed the AIR RAND report on Bill Gates's $500 million investment in testing out this theory of teacher evaluation. And it simply didn't work. And it had a lot of negative effects, like demoralizing teachers, discouraging teachers from teaching the weakest and neediest students, and causing them to seek out the most successful students, because then they would be more successful teachers by the metric of test scores. Bill Gates was also not the single biggest funder of the Common Core. He was the only funder of the Common Core. And he put, I don't know how many hundreds of millions, if not billions, into buying support for the Common Core. And it's hard to say that that's been a success, because despite all the claims that everybody would end up with higher scores, no one has ended up with higher scores because of the Common Core. So one could go on with, the other big thing he has is charters. And he's given huge support to charters. I tell the story in the book of his imposition of charters in the state of Washington, which is a whole story into itself. But it took 4 state referenda before he was finally able to get a referendum passed, because he outspent the parents and teachers and civil rights groups of the state of Washington by a ratio of 17 to 1. It's very, very hard when all of your groups together raise 750,000 and the billionaires put up 17 million.
Right.
So anyway, that's Bill Gates. So the third is Eli Broad. And Eli Broad probably is well-meaning, or at least he thinks he's well-meaning, but he has unleashed, first of all, a ton of poorly trained administrators who believe in his top-down, business-minded approach to schooling, where they're trained to believe that closing schools is a really good thing to do, because whatever you replace them with is bound to be better. But it's basically a very destructive business philosophy, which if your business doesn't make money, you close it down and open another one somewhere else. And schools are not businesses. They're part of the warp and woof and weave of a community, and he never has understood that. So in addition to all these unqualified administrators, he has spent a huge amount of money on charter schools, and he's tried thus far without success to turn half of Los Angeles into charter schools, or half the students would be in charter schools. Right now it's about 20%. So he hasn't made it yet because he has yet to gain complete control of the school board. But I discovered, having written about the Billionaire Boys Club and having identified Walton, Gates, and Broad, I discovered in this book that the number of billionaires supporting school disruption and school destruction was really much longer. And I wrote a chapter about who are the disruptors. And one of my readers is one of my grown sons, who's a wonderful writer. And he said, "Mom, this is the worst chapter in your book." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because there's so many names in it." I said, yeah. But you know, what I wanted to do was to show the sheer immensity of the number of incredibly wealthy people and corporations and bought and paid for think tanks who are on the other side, you know, the anti-public school side. And it's overwhelming. So to someone like my son, that's too many names. But to me, this is what comes from digging up all the people who are supporting Jeb Bush's Chiefs for Change and the New Markets, what is it called? The New Schools, what is it? The Venture Fund, New Schools Venture Fund. You look at the funders of all of these groups, and it's simply astonishing. I mean, it's not just Gates and Broad and Walton, it's also John Arnold, it's also Philip Anschutz, who produced Waiting for Superman and who's a billionaire. And it's the DeVos family, and it's the Koch brothers, now the Koch brother. And it goes on and on and on. And, you know, contrary to some critics, I've never said that they're all in this to make money. I don't believe they're in. Once you have $1 billion, your goal is not profit, your goal is power. And that's what this is about. It's about, for the people who are libertarians, they don't want to pay for government, period. And they don't want to be taxed. And this is why the Koch brothers have spent decades fighting Social Security, fighting to privatize Social Security, fighting to get rid of Medicare. And it's about, why should we have to pay for other people? Everybody's on their own. So this is a kind of a passionate libertarianism. It's got nothing to do with profit and everything to do with keeping taxes low, keeping as much money as you can because it's yours, and not giving a hoot about the common good or the welfare of other people who are less fortunate than you.
So that would be the motivation of the libertarians. What do you think, though, about the motivation of people, for example, like Eli Broad? I mean, he seems to support Democrats for the most part. What do you think it is that motivates him to be so hostile toward public schooling?
Well, it's very odd because he is a product of public schools. He and his wife both went to the Detroit public schools. And yet he has been a very big mover and shaker in Michigan, where due to the combination of Eli Broad and Betsy DeVos, public schools in Detroit have been under threat for many years. And he was very active in creating the Michigan Education Achievement Authority and even soliciting some of his people to become the leader of it. And it was a huge failure where they took over low performing schools, very much like the Tennessee education, what is it called? The Tennessee.
The Achievement District?
Yeah, the Achievement School District in Tennessee. Yeah. That was really modeled on New Orleans, but then so was the Michigan Education Achievement Authority. The idea being that you could select the lowest performing schools in the state, hand them over to a charter operator, and then they would work their magic. The only problem is that every one of these efforts has failed. I mean, New Orleans is not a success. I have a chapter about New Orleans. The Education Achievement Authority that Eli Broad had so much to do with was put out of business because they fudged their scores. They experimented with the students using untested technology, and they actually were losing ground. They took the lowest performing students and made them even lower performing. So it was a disaster. The thing that puzzles me about someone like Eli Broad is why he doesn't learn from all of these terrible experiences that his experiment that he has been involved in. And I think it's just that people like him are surrounded with, first of all, yes men and yes women who tell them how great they are all the time. Don't tell them how disastrous their experiments have been. And they just don't hear the whole truth. And maybe they're just not curious, and maybe they're so vain that they think that if it was their idea, it must be a good idea. And next time the implementation will be better. But they keep failing and failing and continuing. And at the end of the book, I conclude that there's so much money there that there will always be people who will say, it'll work next time, give me 100 million and I'll show that it can be done. I think, for example, the City Fund. The City Fund, which was created recently, is really composed of people who've come from already failed reform experiments, New Orleans and Tennessee, and a couple of the others. They're all people who have been involved in these reform experiments to get rid of public schools and replace them with charter schools, none of which have shown positive results. And yet they started on day one with $200 million. And I could only think about them in comparison to the Network for Public Education, Carol, that we started with nothing. And we opened our doors with nothing. They opened their doors with $200 million. What are we doing wrong? Or maybe what are we doing right? But over the past, 5 years or so that we've been around, we have now almost 400,000 people who follow us. And I suspect that the City Fund doesn't have any members at all, but they have a lot of money. And when you have that kind of money, there will always be people who will go to the funder and say, we know how to do it. We can get it right. Here's all we need is 200 million. And for a guy who's worth $5 billion, $200 million is not a big deal.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of change. It's, I don't know. I think about it sometimes, Diane, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but people like Eli Broad, they want the world to be different too, but they want to see the
I've lost your voice.
Hey, Carol. Yeah, or Diane, we all have. So anything in particular about the book that you want to highlight for everybody before we've got another 24 minutes, and hopefully Carol will be able to hop back on and her audio will reconnect. But is there anything else in particular about the book that you think is important for us to highlight for everyone?
Well, I think one of the things I want to highlight is that when people always want to know, how can we fight back? And so that's what I wanted to do by telling these stories, was to show people winning and people winning against what seemed to be impossible odds, whether it was the parents in Douglas County, Colorado, who had a school board that wanted to hand over public money for vouchers for religious schools. And it took years of organizing before they were finally able to turn them out. But it was grassroots organizing. But one of the lessons of the book, I think, is that the most effective way to fight against privatization is to go to a state referendum. And I'm surprised this has not happened in more states. To me, one of the great stories of the book is the story of Massachusetts, because the Waltons targeted Massachusetts, and they decided that they needed this blue state. It was like the jewel in the crown that they were missing. They already had California in their camp because Jerry Brown, while Jerry Brown had many wonderful qualities, he was very pro-charter school, and he stacked the state school board with charter supporters. And they had New York because Andrew Cuomo had already proclaimed himself to be the champion of charters. Why Andrew Cuomo, who's now a national hero because he's been so great during the coronavirus crisis. Well, Andrew Cuomo got most of his campaign funding from Wall Street. And the one thing that the Wall Street people wanted was an ironclad commitment that Cuomo would be a charter school champion. And so he promised that he was a charter school champion. So the Waltons they had California, they had New York, and the blue state they were missing and really, really wanted was Massachusetts. And they decided that the only way they were going to get the expansion of charters in Massachusetts was by having a referendum. And they did polling in early 2016, showing them they could, that if they had a state referendum on charters, it would win overwhelmingly. What they didn't count on was that the union didn't agree with them. And the union was led by a very, let's say, uncompromising, militant woman named Barbara Mataloni. And Barbara was absolutely spectacular. She refused to make any deals about charters. And so they said, okay, we're going to go to the referendum and we're going to beat you, said the Waltons, because they had so much money. And they pulled in money from hedge fund managers, from equity investors, from Michael Bloomberg, from the Waltons had tons of money. So what they didn't count on was the union assessed itself. I think there were 110,000 members. They assessed each member $100, which they could pay for. That raised $9 million. They got some money from the NEA. They got some money from the FT, but they didn't have any outside money other than the support of the national unions. So the Walton reformers, or whatever you want to call them, disruptors, outspent them 2-1. But by the time the vote was held in November of 2016, the unions and parents and local school committees and the other unions, not just the teachers unions, but also all the civil rights groups had allied themselves in opposition to what was called Question 2. And the Waltons were beaten overwhelmingly. The vote was something like 62-38. And the only districts that voted in favor of charters were wealthy white districts that didn't expect ever to see a charter. So, you know, that at the same time, and I didn't write about this, Georgia held a referendum. And again, without anyone like Barbara Mataloni, without this kind of money or organization, the charters went down 60-40 in Georgia. Then in Arizona in 2018, there was a referendum on vouchers. It went down 65-35. And I've wondered why the people of Ohio, for example, have not demanded a referendum on privatization, because I believe that the vote there would be 65-35, if not even greater, because close to 90% of the people of Ohio have their children in public schools. So the big lesson for me is that the public supports public schools, that most people choose public schools. They're not longing to put their kids in a charter. And as Carol has shown in the work she's done on the federal charter school program, charters open and close like daylilies. And parents are really taking a chance when they put their kid in a charter that it may not be there 3 months from now or 6 months from now. And vouchers, of course, have been very, I won't say disappointing, because I was never disappointed by them. They've been disastrous because they're much worse schools than the public schools that children leave.
Diane, I want to let you know, I think we have Carol back on with us. Is that right, Carol? Oh, maybe not exactly.
All right, so we can just go ahead.
No, I think she's, are you, what, you're okay to just keep talking? You're so remarkably good at that.
Well, you know, it's something that I've thought about for many years. I was working on this article for Education Week, and I started thinking, how long have I been a historian of education? I realized I got my doctorate in 1975, so it's been 45 years, and you got to master your field after 45 years.
This is true. And Diane, we do have questions that are starting to come in. So I'm going to ask you one, and then I'm going to start sending some more over to Marla so she can get them all organized.
Great.
So the first question I'm seeing is from Barb Shepard, and he says, what happens after Espinoza versus Montana? How do we fight the privatization via vouchers after that decision?
Well, I think that's a very good question and an important question. And I can't say that I have the fast and ready answer. I think this is the scariest thing on the horizon because this is the court case that I would say everybody should be dreading because of Trump's 2016 victory. He put 2 religious zealots on the Supreme Court. And there's right now, as you know, a 5-4 conservative majority. And the question is, how radical are they in their conservatism? I mean, a true conservative would not want to destroy public education in America. And I think that both Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh are both radical conservatives. And this was foreshadowed in terms of their decision about a baker in Colorado who refused to bake a cake for a gay couple. They were getting married and they asked him to make a cake and he wouldn't do it. The Supreme Court upheld the baker and said that if it violates your religious principles, you shouldn't have to serve someone who is offensive to you. Well, this opens the door to all kinds of discrimination, not just against gay people, but against on other grounds as well. And I think that the question in Espinoza v. Montana is that there's a family that wants they want tax credits, which are really only a few $100s, to send their kids to a religious school. And the state, like most states, has a provision saying no money can go to religious schools, period, end of sentence. And Montana's been very strong about that. And so the conservative attack on the line between the separation between church and state is all of these provisions in state constitutions come from a period in the late 19th century where there was very heightened anti-Catholic feeling. And so they're all based on bigotry against Catholics. And so we should wipe them all out because they're grounded. The not allowing religious schools to participate in public funding is bigoted. The problem with using Montana as an example is that the Montana Constitution was written in 1972, not in 1872. So it was in 1972 that people from all over Montana who joined in the Constitutional Convention said public money should go to public schools. Be that as it may, we have a Supreme Court that is predisposed to say that religious freedom requires that the public should support religious schools, and that to deny them public money is a form of religious discrimination. If that decision comes through in a very broad way, it would mean that in any state in the country, religious schools can then say we need to be funded because we're only spending $4,000 a child or $8,000 a child, and the public schools are spending 50% more, and we want the same funding. Well, you can see that this could be a disaster for public education. It would mean that everybody currently in a religious school, regardless of what religion it is, would be funded. I'm Jewish. I am absolutely opposed to any funding to any religious group, whether they're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, any and every religious group. I think that religious education is a right that people have, but they should pay for it. And that's been a longstanding tradition in American history. And I would like it to be embedded deeply in our psyche, that we don't pay for other people's private choices. But I think that I don't know how this will play itself out. I don't know how states will protect their public schools. I don't know. I doubt that there's going to be a flight to religious schools. I think that what it will mean is not that more kids will leave public schools to attend Jewish, Catholic, evangelical, Muslim, or whatever schools. What it will mean is that the kids currently enrolled in those schools will be publicly funded, which means that there's less money for public education. And that's going to harm our country. Because if you can imagine cutting the school budget across the board by 5, 10, 15%, that's going to be harmful in terms of teachers' salaries, class sizes, access to all the foreign languages. I mean, in a million different ways, it's going to hurt everyone's education if every state is required to pay for religious education. So I'm very concerned about it. I don't know how it's going to play out. And I think there may be individual states that figure out ways to get around it, but I frankly don't know how.
Can you hear me now, Diane?
I can hear you now.
Oh, good.
Oh, welcome back.
Yeah.
Carol Marla has a couple of questions from folks as well. So she's got some questions that she can ask Diane. And Diane,
okay. There's one that I'd like to ask if I could.
Okay.
Now that there's a waiver for testing, I think we're all very, very happy about it. Network for Public Education worked really hard and doing an email drive to Betsy DeVos. Do you think that it will be a little bit easier to make an argument against having federal testing mandates next year?
Not necessarily. There's already a hue and cry coming from leaders of the movement that there should be testing starting in September, that since kids have not been tested in the spring of 2020, they should be tested in September to find out how much they know in September and then tested again the following spring. So they're already saying, you're dealing with people who have a mindset that kids can't survive without standardized testing. And meanwhile, if you look at the best private schools in America, whether it's the place where Bill Gates sends his kids, Lakeside Academy, or any of the other elite schools, they don't have standardized testing. I was asked the other day by a friend of mine who runs a school for kids in Harlem, what did I think was the fairest, most objective way to test children? And I said, let their teachers test them. Their teachers know what they taught them. They should be given tests based on what they were taught, and they should get instant feedback. I think that the current test, the standardized tests, are absolutely worthless. That's my opinion, but unfortunately, that's not the opinion of Congress. So a lot will depend on who's elected president. I think with Trump, there'll be more of the same, and God forbid that should happen. But I think whether it's Biden or Sanders, and I suspect Biden's going to be the Democratic candidate, and as things look now, there's at least a chance to make that argument. Whether he will listen to it or not, I have no idea. But the argument is that the tests have no diagnostic value, and a test with no diagnostic value, a test that you take in the spring, in March or in April, where the results come back in August or September, and they give you no individual diagnostics about what the child does and doesn't know. They just say, here's how they rank. They're in on the top, they're on the bottom, they're in the middle, they're ranked a 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's all useless. Who needs to know that? In terms of all the stuff that people say they want to know, you can get all the information comparing states from NAEP. You can get all the information you need to know about the achievement gaps between groups on NAEP. You can see movement forward or no movement forward, mostly no movement forward on NAEP. All that's there. Why do we need to test every single child in America between grades 3 and grades 8? Because the tests that we're using don't tell us anything about the individual children, and they really have no diagnostic value. So I'm totally opposed to them. And do I think that Congress will be? Not at this point, because even now, the leading, the groups that call themselves civil rights groups, like Education Trust, whether it was led by Katie Haycock or now by John King, and also the Center for American Policy, which is supposedly the mainstream establishment Democratic think tank, they put out a statement just a week or so ago saying that standardized testing was a civil right. Wow. They're listened to by Congress because they represent the establishment, and it's just not true. It's not a civil right. You need to look back only at the last decade or so of NAEP and say, we've seen no improvement, and we've tested kids to the point where they, where they cry. What has been the point of all of this? It hasn't improved performance, has no diagnostic value, and the only beneficiaries here are the big testing corporations. So will anything change? I wish that I could be hopeful and say, yes, we'll find out that we really didn't need the test, but we won't have any evidence of that. We'll just say, thank goodness we had 1 year where the test were not given, and we had a breather. But we have a lot of work to do to persuade the decision makers that these tests are produce nothing of value.
Well, before we get to some of the other questions, just a thought on that. To almost be a devil's advocate on this, I think what might happen if let's say they get their way and we do test in September, I think what we're going to see is the achievement gap widen and widen dramatically. And the reason is going to be access to any kind of online learning and the ability of kids to progress, sort of like that super summer gap that we see. Do you think that will finally convince the ed reformers that it's not the school's fault, it really is poverty?
No, because they don't believe that. They refuse to believe that. They believe that um, somehow if all schools were charters, that there would be, I mean, they have no reason to believe that, but nonetheless, I don't see any of them breaking ranks. There a few have. I think of this possible, I don't know if he's a billionaire. He claims he's not a billionaire, but he's a buddy of the billionaires. Nick Hanauer made a statement a few months ago in The Atlantic in which he said, well, I helped pay for a lot of the stuff that Bill Gates has done, and I've gone along with all the charter stuff. But I now realize that the problem in our society is economic, and it's not the schools, and we should stop beating up on the schools. But that got a lot of attention because it was such an unusual thing for anyone to do. So he was a standout, but there are very few, the reform movement, such as it is a huge gravy train. And you don't see very many people. I mean, Nick Hanauer didn't need the gravy, but among those people who are working and making huge six-figure salaries, you're not going to see a lot of defections of people who say, I see the light and we've been wrong all along and we should support public schools and address the dramatic inequalities in our society.
Darcy, do we have any questions from listeners?
We absolutely do. So Marla's going to start asking those.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Marla Kilfoyle. I am the grassroots liaison for the Network for Public Education. Good evening, Diane. It's great to hear your voice.
Hi, Marla.
We have a really good question from Vinny Battalato. And Vinny says, Diane, part of what the billionaires have done that has been successful in pushing this agenda is that they build a deep structure of foot soldiers to keep pressure on local districts and states. Do you think we can activate friendly wealth and philanthropy to develop a counter structure?
Well, I think actually that I sort of partly disagree with his assumption that they have a deep body of foot soldiers. They're all paid foot soldiers. They're all mercenaries. And one of the points that I make in the book is that where we've been most successful is that we rely solely on people who act out of dedication and conviction and passion. And they, you know, like the bats, are like the different parent organizations. People come to meetings again and again and again. All the opt-out parents in New York, nobody was paid in New York to opt out. Nobody was paid to organize the opt-out. It was a movement on a shoestring that persuaded 20% of the parents of eligible students not to take the test. And wherever there's been a successful reform, a successful resistance movement, it has been built on the shoulders of unpaid volunteers. But when you look at what they have on the other side is that they have a huge mercenary army. And they have people who are paid, like the City Fund. The purpose of the City Fund, and they've announced the cities that they're going into, is to basically choose candidates and fund them to run for school boards in local school districts and to capture those school boards for the charter people. That's basically announcing out loud, we're here to subvert democracy. We're here to use money from people who've contributed from Washington State and California and New York and other states, and we're coming to your little school district. We're coming to Atlanta, we're coming to Nashville, we're coming to this district and that district. We are here to steal your election and to buy it. And they don't even understand when they announce their purposes that what they're doing is totally anti-democratic and on many levels deeply offensive. So their deep army is a mercenary army. And I don't see any sign at the present that they're going to run out of money because they have an unlimited amount of money. On the other hand, I've seen some hopeful signs that maybe they're losing enthusiasm for the task because at some point, even billionaires have to recognize reality. The first hopeful sign that I saw of this was about maybe 6 weeks ago. Education Week reported that philanthropies were abandoning the K-12 reform movement and because they felt there were no results. And I don't remember the names or even if they gave the names of these philanthropies. It certainly wasn't Gates or Walton or Broad, but that they were abandoning K-12 reform And they were going to be focusing instead on things like education in the arts, education and disrupting the school to prison pipeline, and things of this sort where they thought they could have an impact. Whereas the reform movement, such as it is, has had no impact at all. So I thought that was kind of hopeful, because if we can begin to peel off the middle-sized foundations who don't have a vested interest in making a hero of Eli Broad or Bill Gates or the Waltons, then the movement, I think, is going to lose foot soldiers. Because I have to say that the undercurrent of my book was to send a message to the disruptors and reformers, and to say, guys, this isn't working. You mean the people who work for you won't tell it to you, I'll tell it to you. It's not working. How much longer do you want to invest in failure?
Thank you, Diane. We have another question from Robin Williams. And it really speaks to, I know, a topic that you wrote extensively about in the book, about charters. So Robin writes, the Republican-controlled legislature has made it difficult to get a statewide referendum. They've also diverted a lot of revenue sources to charter and private schools. It would be very difficult to vote them out. So her question is, what strategy would you recommend for stopping charters in Florida?
Well, the only way you're ever going to stop charters in Florida is by, first of all, an intensive public education campaign. There are some really good groups in Florida. And I'm thinking now, one that I quoted in the book is called Integrity Florida. It's not an education group per se, it's a government watchdog that's committed to ethics. And they said, and I quoted them at length in the book, that the charter movement has been basically bought and paid for by vested interests, and that the legislature is loaded with conflicts of interest, that there are people in the legislature who either own or are paid by charter organizations, and that all of this has to be exposed. The League of Women Voters in Florida has been very active and very effective in trying to get this message across. But frankly, unless you vote these people out, unless you expose them and pursue them for their conflicts of interest and for their abandonment of public education, there's no way to turn it around as long as the decision-making power remains in the hands of people who are literally pocketing money. I have to mention that I was interviewed at one point by someone from NPR in Florida, and having read her work, I thought it was going to be at least a neutral interview, but it was very unsettling, because when I pointed out that how many legislators in Florida have conflicts of interest, and pointed out that the state commissioner of education in Florida, who was previously the Speaker of the House in Florida, Richard Corcoran, his wife runs a charter school. Well, you know, I could go on listing all the people in the legislature who have financial conflicts of interest. And she said, well, what about the teachers who are elected to the legislature? Don't they have conflicts of interest? And I said, no, they are advocating on behalf of millions of children, thousands of teachers, and there's no money going into their bank account. I mean, if teachers are paid another $10,000 a year, it doesn't go into their pocket. And even if it's $10,000, it's not $1 million. So I thought that the comparison was very disturbing, because it somehow, and we hear this all the time, oh, how can you talk about the Waltons being powerful when we're up against the NEA and the AFT? Well, the NEA and the AFT are working with the dues of teachers. They're not they're not sitting on $150 billion made from their parents' investment in retail stores. So the comparison is a ridiculous one. But you know, what hope is there for Florida? You got to let the people know 80% of the children in Florida are in public schools. That means that 80% of the voters have an interest in not expanding charters. Charters suck $2 billion a year out of the Florida public schools, and vouchers take $1 billion out of the public schools. Well, think what you could do with that $3 billion in the public schools instead of in private institutions. Florida, by the way, has one of the highest failure rates of charters of any state in the nation.
Thank you, Diane. To follow up on the charter question, we have a really good question from Michelle Smith from Indiana. She writes that they are experiencing a massive inflection of innovation network and charter schools, also known as the Mind Trust. which have unlimited access to policymakers. They no longer have an elected state superintendent or an elected board of education. How does an educator fight this when they feel their vote no longer counts?
Well, I'm very aware of Indiana. One of our board members of the Network for Public Education, Phyllis Bush, was the leader of the Northeast Indiana Friends of Public Education and tragically died of cancer last year. And I've been to Indiana several times, and you were in a desperate situation. I'll put it that way. The only, it's like everything else. The only way you can possibly win is by voting these scoundrels out. And like every other state, you have got the overwhelming majority of children are in public schools. They're not in charter schools, and they're not taking vouchers. I mean, the voucher schools in Indiana have been a failure, and yet your legislators are going to give them more money. The charters have not been more successful than public schools, but you've got a state legislature, as you well know, and a governor who are committed to giving them more and more of the money that should be going to public schools. And unless you can get a referendum on the ballot, excuse me, and they'll do everything they can to prevent that from happening. The only way to turn it around is to begin electing the people who are running against them. I mean, you did a few years ago elect Glenda Ritz as state superintendent. And now, of course, they took away the elected state superintendent so that they can control education completely. But the election of Glenda Ritz gives me some hope that there's a public out there that's willing to vote the other way. If you can reach them and persuade them that these people are actually they're not spreading opportunity, they're spreading harm. And it's going to take a tremendous grassroots effort, Michelle, to get across to the voting public that these guys are voting against the self-interest of your children and their children.
And I'm going to kind of weave two questions here, Diane. I'm going to weave a question from Peter Rawitch and Nancy Flanagan. We know that obviously the current pandemic has shown a lot of inequities in education, because most of us are now remote learning. And Nancy points out that, the coronavirus has been the ultimate disruption, and disruption is a factor that reformers keep insisting is necessary, as you write in your book. Tech merchants have already been trying to capitalize on this crisis. But Nancy asks, can't it work both ways? What windows of opportunity do you think might be open for public education, unfortunately, as a result of this catastrophe?
Well, of course, none of us knows what deep changes will occur in our society or in any part of it as a result of this disaster that we're living through. I mean, none of us in our lifetime has seen anything like this. But I think that the lesson that I take, and I could be wrong because it may be just my biases speaking, is that people will come away from this experience of enforced isolation and solitude and home teaching and how difficult it is, that they will come away from it with a great appreciation for the importance of teachers, that they will understand that face-to-face contact is always going to be better than distance learning. I mean, there's a possibility, and it's my hope, and as I said, it may be just my bias, that this intense and very widespread, almost universal exposure to distance learning will create a massive distaste for it. I was talking to one of my grandchildren today, and he was showing me his schedule, and his class, he's in first grade, his class has 3 Zoom sessions a day. And I said, do you like it? He said, I hate it. I want to see my friends. I want to be with my teacher. I love my teacher. I think that this could be a very important learning experience. God knows we don't need it. But the only good thing that might come out of it is a restored respect for the importance of human interaction. And as they say, the bloom may be off the rose of distance learning, but now that we've all experienced it, a lot of parents will say, no, we did that. We don't want to do that. Thank you very much. I want Mr. Jones or Miss Smith to teach my child.
Do you think it's possible too, Diana, we might be able to make the argument that given how limited resources are going to be when we emerge from this, that we really cannot afford to continue to spend money and waste money on experiments like charter schools and vouchers?
Well, I wish you're right, but having just talked with Michelle in Indiana and others from Florida, I know that the ideological commitment to charters and vouchers is so deep that, it started with charters and vouchers with the claim that they would raise test scores, that they would save poor children, they would save poor kids from failing public schools. And then as the results began to come in, it became obvious they were not saving anybody from anything, that many of the charters were in fact failing schools, and that those that succeeded by pushing out the kids they didn't want. And that has not slowed the enthusiasm. I mean, you look at someone like Betsy DeVos, she knows that vouchers don't improve test scores. She knows that all the studies are, I assume she knows, she certainly has access to all of this. But I always remember what she said when the latest DC evaluation came out, the DC evaluation of vouchers, and it said that the kids who took the vouchers in DC actually lost ground compared to their peers in public schools in DC. And she said, well, that didn't surprise her at all, that she expected that once choice was fully implemented, that all three sectors, whether it was public, charter, or vouchers, would get about the same results. Well, since the results were bad, that means that all three sectors would get bad results. And this is not, in a way, surprising to me, because we already have this example in Milwaukee. Milwaukee has all three sectors, and all three sectors get about the same results, and they're all horrible. So, my answer to your question is people who want charters and vouchers have an ideological commitment that is so powerful that they don't care about results.
Diane, some of the heroes that you mentioned in your book, Slaying Goliath, are early childhood heroes. And, that would be like Dr. Denisha Jones and Defending the Early Years. We have a question from Alice Mulligan. And Alice writes, during this health crisis, New York City, as with much of the nation, is providing remote instruction. Alice is a director of pre-K for All program, and she's concerned with the expectation of the Department of Education that remote instruction will be provided to 4-year-olds. Can you speak a little bit to that, Diane?
Well, this is actually a ridiculous and terrible idea. I don't see any value to it. I think that it must be very, very hard for parents of very young children to be in isolation, because one of the great values of early childhood education is the socialization that's integral to it. And the one thing that is denied to children, young children, children of all ages, is socialization. So that let's say the basis of early childhood education is being denied to them now, and they cannot be replaced by watching other children on a television screen.
Diane, we have a question from Lindsay Jacobs, and Lindsay's from South Carolina. She writes, hi, Diane. I am a public and advocacy director with Public Education Partners in Greenville, South Carolina. Historically, public ed advocacy work in South Carolina has been done largely reactive, particularly when it comes to privatization efforts like vouchers. How might we be more strategically proactive?
Well, I think that the most important thing you can do is to reach out to public school parents and to do a job of public education. I mean, I keep coming back again and again that we have to educate the public. And the thing that scares me about vouchers is first of all, they take money from public education. So most kids don't want to go to religious schools. And the religious schools themselves are not very good schools. The line that's always used to sell vouchers is that poor kids and middle-class kids should have the same choices as rich families. Well, this is ridiculous, because the rich families in South Carolina are not getting a voucher, are not spending $5,000 for their private schools. They're probably spending $25,000 or $30,000, and no one is going to get a voucher that will enable them to go to these elite schools that the rich go to. I mean, in big cities, the good private schools cost $50,000. So when a kid gets a voucher that's worth $6,000, the kind of religious school they'll go to will be one that has uncertified teachers, where they're using textbooks that are not teaching modern science, modern history, or modern anything. So I think in a state that's as conservative as South Carolina, it's hard to make what I would consider the honest argument. The honest argument is that religious schools are just not as good as public schools, and that if you go to a religious school, that's fine, that's your choice, but the public shouldn't pay for it. And religious education should take place in Sunday school on Sundays.
Diane, one of the groups that you write about in Slaying Goliath is Teach for America, and you write about some of our great Davids like Julian Vasquez Heilig. We have a question regarding pre-service teachers from Sarah. And Sarah says that she teaches pre-service teachers at the University of Cincinnati, and to educate them about the problems of privatizations and the disruptors, they often feel quite discouraged and question their career choice entirely. What do you suggest that Sarah says to them to empower them to become teachers and to be a part of the resistance?
Well, what I always say is that when you become a teacher, you're entering it basically into the trenches and a very important battle for the future of our society and the future of our democracy. And that this is a difficult profession because, first of all, the work is very hard, but it's probably the best work you'll ever do. And people who teach do so not because they expect to make a lot of money. They're not going to Wall Street, and they're not going to be pulling down huge six-figure salaries. But what they are going to have is a job that's incredibly satisfying. And I think that when you get away from the national media, at least until recently, what you find is that teachers are very respected in their community. And this is a kind of respect that's reserved for people who are doing incredibly valuable things. And I think that one of the good things that might come out of this terrible period is a newfound respect for the profession of teaching, because parents are doing it and finding it very, very difficult. And what you see again and again on social media is, I've been doing this for a week and I'm ready to throw my hands up. Or, you know, I have 3 kids and I'm supposed to, I feel like I've become their assistant. They're 3 little CEOs. Each one of them has a different schedule. The distant learning for each of them is different. The schedule is different. How am I supposed to do this? And I think that what I would say to the young people who want to become teachers is, this will be the hardest possible job you could have, but also the best and the most rewarding. And I recall saying it to someone, you know, when these kids grow up, they won't remember who the governor was. They won't remember who the mayor was. They won't remember who their principal was, but they'll remember you.
Diane, we have a question from Ellen. Ellen writes, this is an interesting question. Ellen writes, do you see any value in pitting the pro-charter folks against the pro-voucher folks in hopes they will destroy each other? There's some early anecdotal evidence in Michigan that these 2 groups are very wary of each other.
Well, you know, it's an interesting question, but generally the people who support one also support the other. And there's been a lot of strategic thinking in which people like the Waltons, for example, they really want vouchers, but they decided a long while back that it was easier to get charters because there wasn't any conflict with the Constitution. And so they went all in for charters, but if they had their druthers, they would be promoting vouchers. And Betsy DeVos really loves vouchers best of all, but she tried to get vouchers in Michigan in the year 2000, and she and her husband funded a referendum, and the referendum it went down overwhelmingly. So they couldn't get vouchers, so they went all in for charters. So it's really a strategic kind of thing where they pick which one they're going to push the hardest, depending on what's easier to get through. But when you peel away the surface, Betsy DeVos is would throw the charters overboard in a millisecond because she really wants vouchers. And she showed that when the Trump people came up with their budget to consolidate 29 different federal programs and throw them into a block grant for the states. It seems like ancient history now, but it was only a couple of months ago. And they were prepared to throw out the federal charter schools program, which the Network for Public Education has been very critical of. And she has sole control of $440 million a year, which she uses to subsidize the big corporate charter chains like KIPP and IDEA. But she was willing to throw that overboard because what she really cares about is vouchers.
Diane, one of the first questions that we got, I wanted to wait to ask you a little bit more towards the end, is one of the great heroes in your book that you write about is the Pastors for Texas Children, Reverend Johnson. And he wanted to ask you a question. When are you going to be moving back to Texas? They need you there.
Well, it's funny because Charlie Johnson had invited me to do a 3-day tour in April. And I was going to do a kind of a Zoom through luncheon in Houston and Austin and Dallas. I was very excited about it because I grew up in Houston and I have friends in Texas and love going back there for all kinds of reasons. And then this coronavirus broke out and I realized this was not going to happen. So we have pushed it off till October and we're praying that by October this is behind us. But I hope that in October I can do that because the Pastors for Texas Children has been an inspiration. If you had asked me when I was growing up if someday I would be working alongside Baptist ministers, I would have said you were crazy. Because, you know, as I said, I'm Jewish, but I love Charlie Johnson and his group has just been amazing. They've helped create similar groups in other states like Oklahoma, where there's Pastors for Oklahoma Children. They're working with pastors in Indiana and Kentucky and other, especially in southern and midwestern states. And I've heard Charlie talk about how when the pastor comes and puts his hand on the legislator's shoulder and says, you know, we really don't want to have vouchers because that's going to destroy our little community school. And that's the school you went to. That's the school your children went to. And if we have vouchers, everybody's going to be peeling off and going somewhere else and it's going to hurt our school. And so what the pastors have been so effective doing is to create a coalition between the rural Republicans who understand the importance and the value of their public schools and the urban Democrats who understand that it's the right wing that wants to destroy public education and privatize it. And they've created this very powerful coalition that session after session in Texas has stopped the vouchers, which is, you know, when you consider that Texas is a state like many others, which is it's red, possibly tending purple, they have done a powerful job there of stopping, particularly the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick is a guy who was like the Rush Limbaugh of Texas, and he's now the Lieutenant Governor, which is a very powerful position, in some ways even more powerful than the governor. And they have come up against the voucher people who are very well funded, and they've beaten them, I think, in 3 consecutive sessions. So they're just doing a tremendous job, and they do it through networking and through the power of appealing to people's, let's say the better angels of people's nature, that we want to have a democratic society where the public schools serve the common good and where nobody is really diverting money for their church schools. If you want your church school, that's fine, but you pay for it out of your own pocket.
And Diane, this is going to be my last question. You talk a lot about being inspired by teacher movements in this country in the book and what really kind of drove you to write it. I don't think we can talk about great teacher movements in this country unless we talk about the Chicago Teachers Union, who really started putting teachers in the street en masse, and the leadership of the great Karen Lewis. Can you talk about the inspiration of CTU and Karen Lewis for our last question?
Sure. When I wrote The Death and Life of the Great American School System in 2010, that was right around the time that Karen and her Congress of the CORE, I was going to say Congress of Responsible Educators. I can't remember what any of the acronyms stand for tonight, but her group was elected and she became the president of the union around that time. And I reached out to someone that I thought might know her. And I said, I would love to meet Karen Lewis. I'm flying from Detroit to Los Angeles, and I could stop in Chicago, and I'd just like to meet her. So I got a message from Karen, and she said, well, don't just have a stopover for an hour, stop over for 4 hours, because we need to talk. So I arranged it that way, and she and her husband rented I don't know, some kind of like airport hotel. And we just sat and we talked and talked. And she showed me her copy of my book. It was covered with Post-its and underlining and so forth. And she said, I've read every word of your book. I love it. And I said, you know, she was amazing. I just fell in love with her. I literally love this woman. And when the Network for Public Education held I think its second annual meeting, we were in Chicago. And Karen had by then already been stricken by a brain tumor. And she was on a walker, and she came and spoke at our meeting, and she was inspiring. And I asked a somewhat embarrassing question because both Lily Escalfon Garcia and Randy Weingarten were there, and I said, do you think that there should be based on the strike you had in Chicago in 2012, which was so successful, do you think teachers should have a national strike? A stupid question, actually. And she said, well, you know, to have a strike and make it work, you have to do tremendous community organizing. You really have to do the grassroots work of knowing that the parents are with you, that you've made plans for the children, and having the parents understand that you're not striking for yourself, you're striking for their children. And she, as I said, was an inspiration, and she's so wise. And I was in Chicago in my early part of my book tour. And I was there in January, and I asked if I could meet with her. She's in an assisted living facility outside of Chicago, and her brain is still razor sharp. She's very, very ill. She's had a stroke, and it was heartbreaking in a way to see her, but also it reminded me of what an incredible woman she is, and how she had the rhetoric, the ability to inspire people, and also the deep understanding, first of all, of teachers, but secondly, of the importance of building grassroots support that goes beyond just your union. You have to really have the community on your side. And I think when I look at I went from Chicago, by the way, to West Virginia, to Charleston, West Virginia, where I met with people who had been part of the strike there. And they talked to me about how they had done that, how they had made sure that every child had a place to go, and that parents understood that they were striking for the children. That was Karen Lewis's great inspiration and her great insight. And, you know, I love this woman. I gave her a copy of my book, and all it said was, I love you, Karen. She's an inspiration.
Diane, we know that you are an inspiration to all of us, and we're always so grateful for everything that you give us. And what is it that keeps you going and keeps you going in this fight?
Well, you know, it started out, what kept me going, and I have to say it keeps me going again and again, is when I see people who are billionaires using their vast wealth to destroy what belongs to the public. I just get angry. And I don't know, that's probably not a good reason to keep going, but I feel like I have a platform, and I have to use it for people who don't have a platform. And that's why I open my blog to lots of other people, so that they can have a voice and they can have a place to speak out.
And we are so, so grateful that you do that. Diane, thank you so much. Be well, be healthy. And we really hope that we're all going to be able to get together and at the end of November and keep on fighting the good fight for our public schools, our teachers, but most of all for America's children. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And you know, since you filled up the 100 spots so quickly, I would encourage you to do it again and keep going, as long as there are people who want to talk about how we help our schools and our kids.
I think we'll do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.